The black cars moved fast through the wet London streets, faster than protocol usually allowed, and that alone told Grace Hartley that something was wrong before anyone said a word. She stood behind the security rope outside the Continental Hall, her name tag still slightly crooked from how quickly she had pinned it on that morning. She was not supposed to be this close to the arrival point. She was a junior aide, third in line for translation duties, the kind of person who checks coats and prints schedules, not the kind of person who stands where kings and queens step out of cars. But the two senior interpreters assigned to the visit of Queen Elena of Astora had both been pulled away an hour earlier for an emergency briefing, and somehow, through a chain of rushed phone calls and one overwhelmed events manager, Grace had been told to stand by, just in case. She did not expect to be needed. Queen Elena's people had their own interpreters traveling with her, fluent men and women in sharp suits who had rehearsed every phrase of the state visit down to the smallest bow. Grace was a backup for a backup. She told herself that twice as she watched the motorcade slow at the gates. The rain had just stopped, but the pavement still held that dark shine that made the cameras flash twice as bright. Reporters pressed against the barriers, umbrellas dripping, phones raised. Somewhere behind Grace, a man in an earpiece muttered something urgent into his sleeve, his eyes scanning the crowd instead of the cars. Grace noticed that. She always noticed the things other people missed, a habit her grandmother used to call listening with your eyes. The first car door opened, and two members of the Astoran security detail stepped out, glancing left and right, before nodding toward the second car. That was when Grace saw it. A man near the edge of the crowd, dressed like any other bystander in a gray coat and dark cap, was not watching the Queen's car like everyone else. He was watching the security men. His lips moved, quick and quiet, and though Grace could not hear him from that distance, something about the shape of his mouth caught her attention. It was not English. It was not French, or German, or any of the languages she recognized from years of study. It was Valak. Grace's stomach tightened. Valak was the language of Astora, spoken by fewer than 2 million people in the entire world, most of them living in the Queen's own small mountain kingdom. It was not a language people learned by accident. Grace had learned it because of her grandmother, who had been born in a village outside the Astoran capital, and who had filled Grace's childhood with old songs and old words, long before Grace understood why they mattered. She had never expected to use it standing on a London pavement in the rain. The man in the gray coat said something short, sharp, to someone Grace could not see, and then he slipped back into the crowd exactly as the Queen stepped out of her car. Grace almost didn't catch it. If she had blinked at the wrong second, if she had been looking at the Queen like everyone else, she would have missed him completely. But she had heard the phrase, the words as clear as a struck bell in her mind, low and hurried. Not here. Wait for the hall. Watch for my signal. It could have meant nothing. Strange phrases floated through every crowd, harmless words from harmless people. But something about the way the man's shoulders had gone rigid, the way his eyes had cut toward the side entrance of Continental Hall instead of the Queen herself, made the back of Grace's neck go cold. She looked around for someone to tell. The nearest security officer was 15 feet away, talking into his radio, his attention fixed on crowd control near the barriers. Grace took one step toward him, then stopped. What would she even say? That a man in a gray coat had spoken 4 words in a rare language, and then disappeared into a crowd of hundreds? She had no proof. She had a feeling, and feelings did not stop motorcades. By the time she turned back, Queen Elena was already moving up the red carpet toward the entrance, flanked by aides, her chin high, her expression polished into the calm, distant look of someone who had spent a lifetime being watched. She looked exactly like her photographs, poised and unreadable, a woman used to speaking through layers of translators and handlers so that her real thoughts rarely touched the open air. Grace fell into step at the edge of the official party, not because anyone had told her to, but because nobody had told her not to, and some instinct she could not name pushed her forward. She kept her eyes moving across the crowd, searching for the gray coat, but the man had vanished into the mass of umbrellas and cameras, as if he had never been there at all. Inside the hall, the noise dropped from a roar to a hush. Marble floors, high ceilings, the smell of fresh flowers arranged in tall vases along the walls. A line of dignitaries waited to be introduced, and Grace found herself pressed near the back, close enough to see the Queen but far enough to be forgotten. She kept scanning faces. Nothing looked wrong. Everyone smiled, the practice smiles of formal events. Everyone stood exactly where they were supposed to stand. And slowly, Grace began to wonder if she had imagined the whole thing. If 4 words spoken in a rare language on a rainy street were nothing more than a strange coincidence. Then she saw him again. He was inside now, wearing a staff jacket that did not quite match the others, standing near a side door marked for kitchen and catering staff only. He was not carrying a tray. He was not doing anything a caterer would do. He was simply standing there, one hand resting near his coat pocket, his eyes fixed on the Queen as she moved slowly down the receiving line, shaking hands, exchanging brief pleasant words through her official interpreter. Grace's heart began to beat harder. She was not a security officer. She was not trained for this. She had spent the last 2 years of her life buried in language textbooks and quiet library corners, not learning how to read danger in a stranger's stance. But she understood, with a certainty that surprised her, that something was about to happen, and that if she did nothing, she might be the only person in that entire glittering hall who had heard the warning. She began moving toward the nearest security officer, weaving between guests in evening wear, her pulse loud in her own ears. She was halfway across the room when the Queen's official interpreter, a tall, silver-haired man named Mr. Aldrich, stumbled over a phrase during a brief exchange with the British Foreign Secretary. It was a small stumble, the kind that happens under pressure, but it drew a ripple of attention, a pause in the room's rhythm, and for one unguarded second, Queen Elena's composed expression flickered into something close to frustration. She turned her head slightly and murmured something under her breath in Gaelic, not meant for the room, not meant for anyone but herself. It was a private complaint, soft and quick, the kind of thing a tired traveler says when she thinks no one can understand her. These people never get the words right. I am so tired of being spoken about instead of spoken to. Grace, still moving through the crowd, heard it clearly. And without thinking, without planning, without any idea of what it would set into motion, she answered, "I understand you perfectly, Your Majesty," she said quietly, in flawless Gaelic, as she reached the edge of the receiving line. "And I think we may have a problem near the kitchen door." The Queen's head turned sharply. For a moment, the entire practiced calm of her face dissolved into pure, startled surprise, her eyes locking onto Grace as if she had just heard a ghost speak. But there was no time to explain further, because at that exact moment, the man near the side door pushed it open and stepped through, disappearing from view, and somewhere behind Grace, a security radio crackled to life, with a voice that was no longer calm at all. The Queen's gaze snapped from Grace to the door and back again, and in that single frozen second, something passed between them that neither one could yet put into words. Grace did not know what came next. She only knew that the quiet, ordinary morning she had expected was gone, and that whatever was about to happen inside Continental Hall, she was now standing directly in the middle of it. The nearest guard reached for his radio, but Queen Elena raised one gloved hand, a small, precise motion that somehow silenced the noise around her without a single word. Everyone in the receiving line seemed to lean in, unsure whether to keep smiling for the cameras or to notice that something had shifted. "Say that again," the Queen said to Grace, still in Gaelic, her voice low and steady now, though her eyes had not lost their sharp edge. Slowly. "There was a man outside, before you arrived," Grace answered, keeping her own voice just as quiet, her English training telling her to slow her breathing, even as her heart pounded. He spoke Gaelic to someone in the crowd. He said, "Not here. Wait for the hall. Watch for my signal." I saw him again just now, near the kitchen door, wearing a staff jacket that did not match the others. He just went through that door. For half a second, the Queen's face was unreadable, caught between disbelief and something colder, something that looked almost like recognition, as if this was a fear she had carried quietly for a long time, and had finally heard spoken aloud by a stranger. "Aldrich," she said sharply, switching effortlessly to English and turning toward her official interpreter. "Get security to that door. Now." Quietly. No cameras. Mr. Aldrich, still flustered from his earlier stumble, blinked in confusion. "Your Majesty, I did not catch what was—" "There is no time," the Queen said, and then, astonishing everyone within earshot, she reached out and took hold of Grace's wrist, not roughly, but firmly, the grip of someone used to making fast decisions. "You, come with me. Tell me everything you heard, and do not stop until I say so." Grace's mind raced. She was a junior aide. She was not supposed to touch royalty, let alone be pulled along beside one through a crowd of dignitaries, while cameras flashed and confused officials tried to figure out what was happening. But there was no time to protest, and some part of her, the part that had grown up hearing her grandmother's old warnings about trusting your instincts, told her that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. The two of them moved together toward a quieter corner near a tall marble column, half hidden from the main crowd, while behind them, security officers finally began converging on the kitchen door with the kind of quick, controlled urgency that told Grace her warning had been taken seriously. "Tell me everything," the Queen said again. Her eyes locked on Grace's face with an intensity that made Grace feel, for one strange moment, as if she were the only other person in the entire hall. And so Grace began to speak, her voice steady, despite the pounding in her chest, describing the gray coat, the 4 whispered words, the way the man's eyes had tracked the security detail, instead of watching the Queen like everyone else in the crowd. As she spoke, Queen Elena listened without interrupting, her expression sharpening with every detail, and somewhere behind them, the low murmur of the crowd began to rise again, most of the guests still unaware that anything unusual was happening at all. It was only when Grace finished, breathless, that the Queen finally spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "You are the first person in 3 years who has understood every word I said without needing it repeated to them," she said. "And you may have just saved me from something far worse than an awkward evening." Neither of them yet knew how true that sentence would turn out to be, or how much the next few hours would change everything about the visit, about the man in the gray coat, and about the unlikely bond now forming between a queen who had grown used to being surrounded by people who could not understand her, and a quiet young woman who understood her perfectly. The kitchen door led into a narrow service corridor, lit by a single flickering bulb, and by the time 3 security officers reached it, the man in the mismatched staff jacket was already gone. A cracked window near a delivery entrance told the story well enough. He had planned an exit before he ever planned an entrance, which told the security chief, a broad-shouldered man named Owen Price, exactly the kind of person they were dealing with. Not a random troublemaker, someone who thought in steps, who prepared for failure before he ever tried to succeed. Grace was not allowed into that corridor. She stood instead in a private side room, just off the main hall, a small space usually reserved for coat storage, now filled with hurried voices and the low static hum of radios. Queen Elena sat in the only chair in the room, her spine straight despite the tension in the air, while Owen Price crouched slightly to speak with her, his voice pitched low. "Nothing conclusive yet, Your Majesty," he said. "No device found. No weapon found. Whoever he was, he left before we reached the corridor." "Then he is still out there," the Queen said, "and he knows exactly how close he came to reaching me." Grace stood near the door, unsure whether she was meant to stay or leave, feeling suddenly very aware of how strange the last 10 minutes had been. An hour ago she had been checking coat tags and double-checking a printed schedule. Now, she was standing in a private room with a queen and a head of security, having just possibly prevented something none of them wanted to say out loud. Owen Price turned toward her, studying her the way a man studies something he does not yet understand. "You're the one who spotted him outside." "Yes, sir," Grace said. "And you understood what he said because you speak Valic." "My grandmother was Astoran," Grace said. "She taught me when I was young. I never expected to actually use it for something like this." Owen's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with the sharp, assessing look of a man recalculating a plan. "How many people on this visit's staff speak Valic fluently, Your Majesty?" "Besides my own people," the Queen said. "Very few. Mr. Aldrich, myself, 2 members of my personal detail." She paused, glancing at Grace with an expression that had shifted since the hallway, no longer simply startled, but thoughtful, calculating in her own quiet way. And now, apparently, one very observant young woman from an English library who was never supposed to be anywhere near this event. "I can leave, if that would be easier," Grace offered quickly, feeling suddenly like an intruder in a room meant for far more important people. "No," the Queen said, the single word landing with quiet finality. "You will not leave. Not until I understand exactly how a threat almost reached me today, without a single one of my own trusted people noticing it first." Owen cleared his throat carefully. "Your Majesty, with respect. We should keep this contained. The fewer people who know how close this came, the better, for security and for public confidence. I agree, the Queen said, which is precisely why she stays close. She already knows. Better she remains where I can see her than wandering back into a crowd carrying information someone else might try to pry out of her. Grace felt a chill at those words, not from fear of the Queen, but from the sudden realization of what it meant to be the one person outside the royal circle who understood exactly what had almost happened. She was no longer just an aide who had gotten lucky. She was, whether she wanted to be or not, involved. The rest of the afternoon moved strangely for Grace, half public spectacle and half quiet tension. The official visit continued on schedule, because canceling it would raise more questions than anyone wanted answered. Queen Elena gave her planned remarks to the assembled dignitaries, her voice smooth and unbothered, her public face giving no sign of the storm behind her calm eyes. Mr. Aldrich resumed his interpreting duties, slightly more careful now, though Grace noticed the Queen occasionally glancing toward her instead of toward him, as if checking that someone in the room truly understood. By early evening, the formal reception had shifted to a private garden terrace behind the hall, reserved for a smaller gathering of officials and advisors. Grace had assumed her unusual afternoon was over, that she would be thanked politely, and sent back to her ordinary desk with an extraordinary story she could never fully explain to her friends. Instead, as the sun began lowering behind the city skyline, one of the Queen's personal aides approached her with a quiet request. Her Majesty would like a few minutes of your time, in the garden, alone, if you don't mind. Grace followed the aide through a set of tall glass doors into a private courtyard, where neatly trimmed hedges lined gravel paths, and the noise of the city faded into a distant hum. Queen Elena stood near a stone fountain, her formal jacket removed, a simple dark shawl draped over her shoulders instead. Without the crown of cameras and officials surrounding her, she looked, for the first time all day, like an ordinary woman, standing quietly in a garden, tired, in a way her public face never allowed her to show.
Thank you for coming,
the Queen said, this time in Valak, as though testing whether the moment in the hall had truly happened, or whether she had somehow imagined it. Of course, Your Majesty, Grace answered in the same language, and watched something ease slightly in the Queen's shoulders, as if simply hearing her own language spoken naturally, without hesitation or mistake, brought a kind of relief that years of formal interpreters never had. Sit with me, the Queen said, gesturing to a stone bench near the fountain. Just for a few minutes. I find I would like to speak with someone today who understands me, without needing my words filtered first. Grace sat, feeling the strange unreality of the moment settle over her, the low golden light of evening, the quiet splash of water behind them, and a Queen beside her speaking freely, in a language almost no one else in the country could understand. How does a girl from London come to speak Valak so well? The Queen asked. Your accent is unusual. Not quite the capital, not quite the mountains. Where did your grandmother come from? A small village near Osthaven, Grace said. She left Astora when she was 19, after her family lost their land during the border disputes. She never talked about it much, the reasons why, but she never stopped speaking Valak at home. She used to say that a language was the last piece of home a person could carry in their pocket, even when everything else was gone. The Queen was quiet for a moment, watching the water ripple in the fountain. Osthaven, she repeated softly. My own mother's family came from near there as well. Perhaps our grandmothers walked the same roads once, long before either of us existed. It's strange to think about, Grace admitted. I grew up hearing stories about a country I had never seen, learning words that no one else around me understood. Sometimes I felt like I was keeping a secret I didn't even choose to keep. I understand that feeling more than you might imagine, the Queen said, though from the opposite direction. I have spent my entire life learning the languages of other countries, smiling through translated conversations, saying the right diplomatic phrases at the right diplomatic moments, while almost never being allowed to simply speak and be understood without effort on someone else's part. Today, for the first time in longer than I can remember, someone answered me honestly, in my own words, without pause. Grace did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, letting the quiet stretch comfortably between them. You saved me from something today, the Queen continued after a moment. Whether it was serious or not, we may never know for certain, but the instinct that made you notice, the courage that made you speak up in a room full of powerful people who could have simply ignored you. That is rare. Rarer than fluency. Rarer than good instincts alone. I almost didn't say anything, Grace admitted quietly. I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that it wasn't my place to interrupt anything. And yet you did, the Queen said. That matters more than you know. She turned slightly on the bench, studying Grace with the same sharp attentiveness she had shown in the hall earlier that day. Mr. Price believes the man who slipped through the kitchen door was not acting entirely alone. There have been quiet threats in recent months, back home, tied to certain political disputes I would rather not detail on a garden bench in London. I did not expect those threats to follow me across an ocean, but today proved that I was wrong to assume distance meant safety. Grace felt a fresh chill despite the mild evening air. Do you think he'll try again? I think, the Queen said slowly, that whoever sent him will not simply give up because his first attempt failed quietly. And I think that for the remainder of this visit, I would feel considerably safer with someone beside me, who can hear exactly what is said around me, in every language spoken, without a delay, without a filter, and without anyone else in the room realizing how much that person actually understands. Grace's heart skipped. Are you asking me to stay close to you for the rest of the visit? I am asking, the Queen said, with the faint, careful smile of someone who rarely had to ask anyone for anything. If you would be willing to help me. Officially, you would simply be assisting with translation duties, nothing more, nothing that draws attention. Unofficially, I suspect we both understand this would be something far more important than checking coats and printing schedules. Grace thought of her ordinary desk, her ordinary week, the safe, predictable life she had been living only that morning. She thought of the man in the gray coat, the cracked window in the service corridor, the low, urgent murmur of security radios. And then she thought of her grandmother, of the old songs sung quietly in a kitchen, thousands of miles from the mountains they described, of a language kept alive out of love and stubbornness across an entire ocean. I'll help, Grace said, before she could talk herself out of it. Whatever you need. The Queen studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, a small, decisive motion. Good, she said, because I believe, Miss Hartley, that the coming days will require exactly the kind of person who listens with more than just their ears. Neither of them could have known, sitting quietly beside that fountain as the London sky deepened into evening, just how true those words would become, or how far the shadow of that gray-coated man would reach before the visit finally came to its end. The next morning, Grace arrived at the private wing of the hotel, where Queen Elena's delegation had settled for the remainder of the visit, wearing a plain gray blazer instead of her usual library cardigan, feeling like an actor who had wandered onto the wrong stage. A junior aide from the Queen's own staff, a sharp-eyed young woman named Bethany Cole, met her at the security checkpoint with a temporary badge and a look that suggested she had already heard the strange story of yesterday's events, though not the full truth behind them. You're the translator they pulled in from outside, Bethany said, not unkindly, as she clipped the badge onto Grace's blazer. Mr. Price wants you briefed before the morning schedule starts. This way. Owen Price was waiting in a small conference room with the curtains drawn, a laptop open in front of him showing a still image pulled from security footage. The man in the gray coat stood frozen on the screen, his face partially turned away from the camera, his features blurred just enough to be frustrating. We pulled every angle we had from yesterday, Owen said, without any greeting, clearly a man who preferred results to pleasantries. This is the clearest shot. Facial recognition came back with nothing useful. No matches in any database we have access to. Either he's never been caught on camera before, or he's very good at making sure he isn't. What about the person he was speaking to in the crowd? Grace asked, remembering the way the man's eyes had cut sideways just before he vanished. Owen tapped the laptop, pulling up a second image, this one a wider shot of the crowd outside Continental Hall. A woman in a dark green coat stood near the barrier, her face turned toward the man in gray, her expression unreadable even at a distance. We found her too, eventually, Owen said. She left the area less than a minute after he did. No name yet, no clear trail. Whoever organized this, they know how to disappear into a crowd. Queen Elena entered the room quietly then, dressed for the day's official engagements, though her eyes went immediately to the frozen image on the screen, rather than to anyone in the room. Any word from home? She asked. Our contacts in Astora are looking into recent chatter, Owen said carefully. There have been rumors for months about a group opposed to the trade agreement you're here to finalize. Nothing confirmed. Nothing that gave us a name or a face until yesterday. The trade agreement, the Queen repeated, her voice tightening slightly. Of course, there are people back home who believe that agreement will weaken our independence, hand too much influence to foreign interests. I have heard the arguments 100 times in closed meetings. I did not expect anyone to carry that argument across an ocean and act on it here. Grace listened carefully, piecing together the shape of the danger surrounding her. This was not a random threat, not an isolated madman acting alone. This was politics turned sharp-edged, a disagreement over a document that could reshape Astora's future, serious enough that someone believed stopping the Queen mattered more than the risk of being caught. What do you need from me? Grace asked, addressing both Owen and the Queen at once. Owen studied her for a moment before answering. Today's schedule includes a private trade discussion at the Astoran Embassy, followed by a public appearance at the university this afternoon. Both events have staff drawn from multiple sources: embassy workers, event volunteers, catering companies. Too many people to vet perfectly in 24 hours. If anyone speaks Valic near Her Majesty today, especially anyone who shouldn't be expected to know the language, I want you close enough to hear it, and I want you to tell me immediately, quietly, without drawing attention. I can do that, Grace said, though her stomach tightened at the thought of spending an entire day listening for danger hidden inside ordinary conversation. The embassy discussion passed without incident, a long table of serious faces exchanging careful phrases about tariffs and trade routes, translated smoothly by Mr. Aldrich, while Grace stood quietly near the back of the room, listening not to the official conversation, but to the murmurs of staff, moving in and out with refreshments and documents. Nothing seemed wrong. No gray coats, no hurried whispered warnings. By early afternoon, Grace began to wonder if yesterday had been a strange, isolated incident after all, a single desperate attempt that had failed and would not be repeated. That comfortable thought lasted until the motorcade reached the university. The public appearance had drawn a large crowd. Students and press gathered along a wide plaza outside the main auditorium, where Queen Elena was scheduled to give a short address about educational partnerships between Astora and Britain. Grace walked a few steps behind the official party, her eyes moving constantly across the crowd, out of habit now, scanning faces, listening for anything out of place beneath the general noise of chatter and camera shutters. It was Bethany Cole who first noticed the delay. The stage team says there's an issue with the sound equipment, Bethany murmured to Owen Price as they approached the auditorium steps. Someone from the university's technical staff needs 10 more minutes to fix a wiring problem. Owen frowned. That wasn't in this morning's briefing. It happens, Bethany said. Equipment fails sometimes. But Grace, standing close enough to hear the exchange, felt an uneasy prickle at the back of her neck. She thought of the man in the gray coat, planning his exit before his entrance, thinking in careful, deliberate steps. A last-minute equipment delay, just long enough to require extra people backstage, extra unfamiliar faces moving freely behind the scenes, while everyone's attention stayed fixed on the growing crowd outside.
I'd like to check backstage, Grace said quietly to Owen, just to listen.
It might be nothing. Owen hesitated only a moment before nodding, gesturing for one of his officers to escort her through a side door into the auditorium's backstage area, a maze of curtains, folded chairs, and tangled cables where a handful of technical staff worked quickly around a control panel. Grace moved slowly along the edge of the space, listening carefully beneath the low hum of testing microphones and shuffled equipment. Most of the conversation around her was ordinary technical talk, wiring issues, sound checks, nothing alarming. She was nearly ready to conclude her instincts had led her nowhere useful when she heard it, low and hurried, coming from behind a tall stack of folded chairs near a side exit. Valic again. 2 voices this time, quick and tense. The delay is working. 10 minutes, maybe less. That's not enough time to reach the panel. It has to be enough. We won't get another chance like this. Grace's blood went cold. She pressed herself carefully against a nearby curtain, straining to hear more, her mind racing to translate every word correctly, even as fear tightened her throat. What panel? The first voice asked. The main electrical box, near the stage left wall? Yes. If it fails during her address, in front of all these cameras, in front of the students, it will look like an accident. It will look like Storie cannot even manage its own equipment abroad. Humiliation, not violence. That was the plan from the start. Relief and fresh alarm hit Grace at the same moment. Not a device, not a weapon. Something more calculated, an act meant to embarrass the Queen publicly, to undercut her authority at the exact moment she was meant to represent her country's strength and independence on foreign soil. It was a different kind of danger than she had feared, but a danger all the same, and one that was about to happen in a matter of minutes. Grace slipped back through the maze of curtains as quickly and quietly as she could, finding Owen Price near the backstage entrance, still coordinating with his team about the crowd outside. "It's not equipment failure," Grace said, keeping her voice low and urgent. "It's planned. 2 people, near the electrical panel on the stage left wall. They're planning to cut the power during the Queen's address, make it look like an accident, in front of the cameras." Owen's expression sharpened instantly. All business now. Show me. Together, they moved quickly through the backstage maze, Owen signaling silently to 2 of his officers to follow without drawing attention. Grace led them toward the stack of folded chairs where she had overheard the conversation, but by the time they reached the spot, the space behind the chairs was empty, nothing left but a loose cable coiled on the floor, and the faint smell of burnt dust near a nearby panel. "They're gone," Owen muttered, already reaching for his radio. "Search the building, quietly. No panic, no press attention." For several tense minutes, the backstage area buzzed with quiet, controlled urgency, officers moving carefully between curtains and equipment stacks while outside. The crowd grew restless, unaware of anything happening behind the scenes. Grace stood near the electrical panel Owen's team had identified, watching as a technician carefully checked the wiring, searching for any sign of tampering. "Here," the technician said after a moment, pointing to a section of exposed wire near the base of the panel, cut cleanly, but not yet fully disconnected. "Somebody started this. Didn't finish. We interrupted them in time," Owen said, relief evident beneath his controlled tone. He turned to Grace, his earlier skepticism from the previous day fully gone now. "You just stopped a very public, very deliberate embarrassment from happening in front of half the press in London." Grace felt her hands trembling slightly, now that the immediate tension had passed, the adrenaline of the last few minutes finally catching up with her. "Do you think they're still in the building?" "Doesn't matter," Owen said grimly. "They know we're onto them now, which means whatever they try next, they'll be more careful, and probably more desperate." He studied Grace for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "You've saved this visit twice in 2 days, Miss Hartley. I don't think that's coincidence anymore. I think it's exactly why Her Majesty asked you to stay close." The address itself proceeded 20 minutes later than scheduled, though the crowd outside never learned the real reason for the delay, only that a minor equipment issue had been resolved. Queen Elena delivered her remarks with the same practiced calm as always, her voice steady, her expression giving no hint of the danger that had passed so close behind the stage curtains only moments before. Afterward, in the quiet of a private car heading back toward the hotel, the Queen turned to Grace, with an expression that mixed gratitude with something heavier, something that looked almost like worry. "Owen tells me you found them before real damage was done," the Queen said quietly. "I got lucky," Grace said. "If I hadn't decided to check backstage, if I hadn't been listening." "You were listening, because you understood the value of listening," the Queen interrupted gently. "That is not luck, Miss Hartley. That is instinct, sharpened by years of caring about a language and a culture that most people around you never bothered to learn." She looked out the car window for a moment, watching the city lights begin to flicker on as evening settled over London. "Whoever is behind this, they are growing bolder, not more cautious. Yesterday, a quiet attempt near a kitchen door. Today, a public humiliation planned in front of cameras and students. I fear tomorrow, they will try something even less subtle." "What's on tomorrow's schedule?" Grace asked, already feeling the weight of the question before the Queen answered. "The state dinner," Queen Elena said quietly. "The largest gathering of this entire visit. Government officials, foreign dignitaries, press from every major outlet. If they intend to embarrass me, or worse, there will never be a bigger stage for it than tomorrow night." The car fell silent after that, the quiet hum of the engine, the only sound between them, as the city rolled past the windows, and Grace found herself staring at her own reflection in the glass, wondering how a simple morning of checking coats had turned, in less than 2 days, into standing at the center of something far larger and far more dangerous than she ever could have imagined. The grand hall where the state dinner was held glittered under 3 enormous chandeliers, long tables dressed in white linen and crystal glassware, hundreds of guests moving between round tables in formal dress, the air thick with polite conversation, and the low music of a string quartet playing near the far wall. Grace stood near the edge of the room, in a simple dark dress Bethany Cole had found for her that morning, her temporary badge tucked discreetly beneath a small pin, feeling entirely out of place among ambassadors and government ministers who had spent their entire careers preparing for exactly this kind of evening. Owen Price had doubled security for the event, plain-clothed officers stationed at every entrance, every hallway, every service corridor leading toward the kitchens. Even so, Grace could see the tension beneath his calm exterior as he moved quietly along the edges of the room, his eyes never resting in one place for long. "Stay close to the head table," he had told Grace before the guests arrived. "If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you come find me directly. Don't wait. Don't second-guess yourself." Grace had nodded, though the responsibility of that instruction sat heavily on her shoulders as she watched the room fill with important, powerful people, any one of whom could unknowingly be standing beside danger without realizing it. Queen Elena arrived precisely on schedule, dressed in deep blue, moving through the room with the same composed grace she always carried, though Grace, who had spent 2 days now learning to read the small signs beneath that composure, could see the careful watchfulness in the Queen's eyes as she greeted guest after guest, her smile polished, her attention sharp. The evening unfolded slowly at first, courses served in careful sequence, toasts offered by the Foreign Secretary and returned graciously by the Queen, polite laughter rippling through the room at well-rehearsed jokes. Grace found herself relaxing slightly as the hours passed without incident, though she never stopped scanning faces, never stopped listening beneath the layers of conversation for anything spoken in a language that did not belong in this particular room. It was during the dessert course, as waiters moved quietly between tables clearing plates, that Grace noticed a woman in a dark green dress standing near a service door at the far end of the hall, her posture too still, too deliberate among the general bustle of staff moving in and out. Grace's breath caught. The dark green coat from the crowd outside Continental Hall, the woman from the security footage Owen had shown her that morning. Grace moved quickly, but carefully through the crowd, weaving between tables without drawing attention, her eyes fixed on the woman near the service door. As she drew closer, she caught fragments of a conversation, low and rushed, spoken between the woman and a waiter whose uniform did not quite fit him properly. The same slightly wrong fit Grace remembered from the man in the gray coat 2 days earlier. "The toast is next," the woman murmured in Valic. "As soon as she stands to speak, you move, not before." "And after?" the waiter asked, his voice tight with nerves. "After, it does not matter what happens to us. It only matters that everyone in this room, everyone watching at home, sees exactly what we want them to see." Grace's stomach dropped. This was different from the electrical panel, different from a quiet embarrassment meant to look accidental. This sounded deliberate, planned for the exact moment when every camera in the room would be pointed directly at Queen Elena, standing to deliver her closing remarks in front of the largest audience of the entire visit. She did not have time to find Owen across the crowded room. The Queen's toast was already being announced by the evening's host, a ripple of polite applause beginning to spread through the hall as guests turned their attention toward the head table. Grace's heart pounded as she calculated her options in the space of a single racing heartbeat. She could push through the crowd toward Owen, losing precious seconds. She could shout a warning, causing panic in a room full of powerful, easily frightened people. Or she could act now, directly, the way she had 2 days ago in the receiving line, when instinct had outpaced fear. She moved toward the head table instead, cutting a path through startled guests, ignoring the surprised glances that followed her hurried steps. Queen Elena was already rising from her seat, smoothing her dress, preparing to step toward the small podium set up near the head table for her closing remarks. "Your Majesty," Grace said quietly but urgently, reaching the Queen's side just as she began to turn toward the podium, speaking rapidly in Valic, so that only the Queen would fully understand the weight of her words. "Do not go to the podium. Not yet." There is a waiter near the service door, and a woman in green from outside the hall 2 days ago. They are planning something the moment you stand to speak. The Queen's eyes widened only slightly. The smallest flicker of alarm quickly smoothed back into practiced calm, though Grace could see her pulse quicken at the base of her throat. Without hesitation, the Queen reached out and placed a gentle but firm hand on Grace's arm, turning them both slightly away from the podium, as though sharing a private, unhurried word before the toast. "Where exactly?" the Queen murmured, her lips barely moving, her public smile never wavering for the watching room. "Service door, far end of the hall, near the kitchen entrance," Grace answered just as quietly. The Queen's eyes flicked briefly across the room, finding Owen Price near the far wall, and with a small, precise motion of her free hand, one that looked to any onlooker like nothing more than an elegant gesture, she signaled him directly. Owen's head turned instantly, his years of training translating that tiny motion into immediate understanding. He began moving swiftly but calmly through the crowd, gesturing sharply to 2 nearby officers as he went. "Stall," the Queen murmured to Grace, "just for a moment." Grace's mind raced. Stalling a Queen's toast in front of hundreds of dignitaries without causing a scene felt impossible, but she thought quickly, stepping slightly forward and speaking in clear, carrying English toward the host who had just introduced the Queen's remarks. "Excuse me," Grace said, forcing her voice to sound calm, almost apologetic. "Her Majesty has asked for just one moment to properly thank the kitchen staff for this evening's exceptional meal, if that would be permitted before her remarks." It was a strange request, unusual enough to draw a few curious glances, but harmless enough that the host, caught off guard, simply nodded, and gestured for the room's attention, to shift briefly toward the kitchen staff being invited forward for a round of applause. It was exactly the kind of small, unexpected pause that gave Owen Price the precious extra seconds he needed. Grace watched from the corner of her eye as Owen and his officers moved swiftly and quietly toward the service door, intercepting the waiter with the ill-fitting uniform just as he reached for something beneath a folded linen cloth on a nearby serving cart. The woman in green, realizing too late that her plan had unraveled, turned sharply toward the exit, only to find 2 more officers already blocking her path. The confrontation happened quickly and quietly, tucked into the far corner of the hall, unnoticed by the vast majority of guests who remained focused on the unusual but pleasant sight of kitchen staff, receiving applause for their evening's work. By the time the Queen finally stepped up to the podium moments later, smiling warmly, delivering her closing remarks with the same composed elegance she always carried, the danger behind the service door had already been quietly, efficiently contained. It was only afterward, once the guests had begun filtering out into the cool evening air, and the grand hall had emptied into a scattering of exhausted staff clearing tables, that Grace finally allowed herself to breathe fully again, her hands trembling slightly, as the full weight of what had almost happened settled over her. Owen found her near a quiet corner of the emptying hall, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and undisguised respect. "They had something under that cloth," he said quietly. "Nothing meant to cause serious harm, thankfully. Some kind of dye packet, designed to burst dramatically the moment the Queen stepped up to speak. Meant to humiliate, meant to create chaos in front of every camera in the room, meant to make the entire evening a spectacle broadcast around the world. Not violence, but damage all the same. The kind that could have unraveled months of careful diplomatic work in a single embarrassing moment." "Who were they?" Grace asked. "Did they say anything?" "Working for someone back in Astoria," Owen said. "Someone with real money and real influence, opposed to the trade agreement, willing to pay for exactly this kind of public embarrassment rather than anything more permanent. We'll learn more once questioning begins properly, but for tonight, the threat is contained." He paused, studying Grace carefully. "3 times now, Miss Hartley. 3 times you've heard something the rest of us missed entirely." "I just happened to be listening," Grace said quietly, though even as she said it, she understood how much more than luck had carried her through the last 3 days. Queen Elena approached them then, having finally excused herself from the last lingering guests, her formal composure softening into something quieter, more human, as she reached Grace's side. "You stalled an entire room full of diplomats with a request about thanking kitchen staff," the Queen said, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time all evening. "I do not think even my most experienced advisors would have thought of something so simple, and so effective." "I panicked," Grace admitted honestly. It was the first thing that came to mind. Sometimes, the Queen said, the best instincts arrive exactly when panic should be slowing us down instead. She reached out and gently took Grace's hand, holding it for a long, quiet moment beneath the dimming chandeliers of the emptying hall. You have done something today that very few people in my entire life have managed. You protected me, not with weapons or with formal authority, but with attention and care, and the simple, powerful choice to listen closely to a world that most people walk past without truly hearing. Grace did not know how to respond to that, so she simply held the Queen's hand a moment longer, feeling, for the first time since this whole extraordinary journey had begun outside Continental Hall 3 days earlier, that whatever came next, she was no longer just a translator standing quietly at the edge of the room. The morning after the state dinner brought a stillness to the hotel that felt almost unfamiliar after 3 days of quiet chaos. News outlets reported only that the evening had gone smoothly, that the trade discussions were progressing well, that Queen Elena's visit was, by every public account, a resounding success. No mention of a woman in a dark green dress, no mention of a dye packet hidden beneath a linen cloth, or a cracked window in a service corridor, or 4 whispered words spoken outside Continental Hall 3 days earlier. The public story remained clean and simple, exactly as Owen Price and his team had worked carefully through the night to ensure. Grace sat in the small conference room where this entire strange journey had truly begun, watching sunlight filter through the curtains Owen had kept drawn only 2 days before. Across the table, Owen himself looked considerably more relaxed than she had seen him since her first briefing, though the exhaustion of the last 3 days still lingered beneath his eyes. The woman in green has a name now, Owen said, sliding a folder across the table, though he did not open it fully, respecting the sensitivity of what it contained. A Storan national, connected to a small but well-funded political faction back home, opposed to the trade agreement. The waiter was hired locally, paid well, likely had no idea how serious the consequences of his actions could have been. Both are in custody, cooperating with authorities from both countries. And the man from outside the hall, the first day? Grace asked. Same network, Owen said. We believe he was meant to create an early, smaller incident, testing security response before the larger plan at the dinner. When his attempt failed quietly, thanks to you, the group adjusted their approach twice more, growing bolder each time out of desperation rather than confidence. He closed the folder, meeting Grace's eyes directly. 3 attempts, 3 times stopped before real damage was done. That kind of consistency isn't luck, Miss Hartley. Whatever you keep telling yourself. Grace allowed herself, finally, to accept that truth without argument. She thought of her grandmother, of quiet evenings spent learning unfamiliar words at a kitchen table thousands of miles from the mountains those words described, never once imagining that decades later, that same language would place her exactly where she needed to be, at exactly the right moments, to make a genuine difference. Later that afternoon, Grace was summoned once more to the private garden terrace behind Continental Hall, the same quiet space where she and the Queen had first spoken freely 3 days earlier. Queen Elena stood near the same stone fountain, though today her posture carried none of the tension Grace had grown used to seeing over the past several days. The threat, for now, had passed, and something in the Queen's shoulders reflected that relief. I leave for Astora tomorrow morning, the Queen said, as Grace approached, still speaking in Valic, the language that had bound them together since that first startled exchange in the receiving line. The trade agreement is finalized. The visit, officially, was everything my advisors hoped it would be. I'm glad, Grace said, meaning it fully. Unofficially, the Queen continued, a faint smile touching her lips. It was something else entirely, something none of my advisors could have predicted, and something I do not think I will ever fully explain to most of them. She turned to face Grace directly, her expression warm in a way that felt entirely different from the polished public warmth Grace had watched her offer to countless dignitaries over the past 3 days. This was quieter, more personal, the kind of warmth reserved for someone who had earned it through something more meaningful than protocol. I have spoken with my private secretary, the Queen said. There is a position within my household, a formal role as personal liaison and translator, working directly with my office, rather than through the usual embassy channels. It would mean travel, time spent both in London and in Astora, and considerably more responsibility than checking coats and printing schedules. Her eyes held a gentle, knowing amusement at that last comparison. I would like to offer that position to you, Miss Hartley, if you are willing to accept it. Grace stood quietly for a moment, absorbing the weight of the offer, thinking of her small library desk, her quiet, ordinary life, before 3 impossible days had rewritten everything she thought she understood about her own quiet skill, with a rare, half-forgotten language. I would need time to think about the details, Grace said carefully, though her heart had already begun answering before her mind fully caught up. But yes, I would like to accept. The Queen's smile deepened, genuine and unguarded. Good, she said, because I find myself, after everything that has happened this week, considerably less interested in being surrounded only by people who translate my words correctly, and far more interested in being surrounded by people who understand them. They stood together by the fountain a while longer, speaking quietly of small, ordinary things, now that the larger danger had passed. Grace's grandmother's old village near Osthaven, the Queen's own childhood spent partly in the same mountain region, the strange, unlikely thread, connecting 2 lives that had never been meant to cross paths in any ordinary way. Before the Queen departed the following morning, she made one final, quiet gesture that Grace would carry with her for the rest of her life. During a brief farewell ceremony held for the traveling press, surrounded by cameras and polished remarks about successful diplomacy, Queen Elena paused deliberately before boarding her car, turning back toward the small gathered group of staff and aides who had supported the visit. I would like to thank one person in particular, the Queen said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled reporters, though her eyes found Grace immediately among the small crowd of staff standing near the entrance. Miss Grace Hartley, whose quiet dedication to understanding my language, and by extension my country and its people, reminded me this week of something I believe every leader should be reminded of more often, that true understanding is never simply about hearing the correct words. It is about caring enough, long before anyone asks you to learn a language that most people would never bother learning at all. A ripple of polite applause moved through the gathered press, most of them assuming this was simply a gracious, diplomatic gesture toward a helpful translator, unaware of the 3 quiet, dangerous moments that truly lay behind those carefully chosen public words. Only Grace, and Owen Price, standing nearby with the faintest knowing smile, understood the full weight of what the Queen had just said. As the motorcade finally pulled away from the hotel, beginning its journey back toward the airport, and eventually back toward the mountains of Storie, Grace stood quietly on the pavement where this entire extraordinary week had begun, remembering the rainy morning 3 days earlier, when she had stood at the edge of a crowd, an ordinary aide, with an unusual, half-hidden skill, never imagining how far 4 whispered words in a rare mountain language would carry her. Her grandmother, she thought, would have laughed with quiet delight at the strange, winding path that had led her granddaughter from a childhood kitchen table in London to a private garden conversation with a queen. She would have said, in her old familiar Gaelic phrasing, that language was never simply about words. It was about the doors those words could quietly open, long after the person who first taught them was gone, waiting patiently for exactly the right moment to matter. Grace watched the motorcade disappear around a distant corner, the city's ordinary noise slowly returning around her, reporters packing their equipment, staff beginning to clear the remaining preparations from the hotel entrance. Her ordinary life, she understood now, would not remain ordinary for very much longer. A new position waited for her, one that would carry her across borders and into rooms far grander than any library reading corner she had known before. But as she turned to walk back into the hotel, already thinking of the phone call she needed to make to her parents, and the quiet, private letter she intended to write to her grandmother's memory that evening, Grace understood clearly that the truest measure of everything that had happened was not the danger she had helped prevent, real and serious as it had been. It was the simple, quiet truth the Queen had spoken so plainly in that garden 3 days earlier. Understanding, offered freely and without expectation of reward, has a way of finding its own quiet, powerful reward in return. A queen who had expected, as she always did, to need a translator standing carefully between herself and the world, had instead found something far rarer and far more valuable. She had found someone who simply understood her, fully and honestly, in her own words, exactly when it mattered most. And for Grace Hartley, that understanding had changed the entire direction of her life. One whispered sentence, one quiet act of courage, and one unforgettable week at a time.